Welcome specimen. Today is Tuesday. You are getting your reset in NA. Tomorrow we are getting ours in EU. But what we are doing first is a round of applause. Yep, round of applause for the 187th birthday of Melbourne. The capital of Australia has been founded today, 187 years ago. Now, talking about today, we haven't checked the situation in the raid for almost a couple of weeks now. We have gone through 2 more raids in the meantime, Sanctum and Sepulchre, and we have gotten all the way back to Castle Nathria. I thought this time, right before the reset comes and we jump into Sanctum, would have been a nice time to check how things have been going in the raid, especially because now we are starting to get our double ups. We're starting to get our second rounds of raids, right? Because we started in Castle Nathria 3 weeks ago with the more or less the same item level, the same power and strength we had at the end of Season 3, so 280-ish item level was the norm when we started Castle Nathria, but now this week players have gotten into Castle Nathria with some 20-ish more item levels at their disposal, and it has been quite fun to see all of the differences that have emerged in the rankings, in the power of certain specs, the performance at the very least of certain specs in the raid. It is quite interesting to imagine a situation like this coming out in a serious tier. You know, imagine if this was a normal patch with a normal race to world first and to get good rankings in your guild kills as well as a much longer tier. It would have been pretty fun to see every week severely different rankings of different specs in raids, right? Because this is what we are getting in this season. This right here was the result of the first week of Castle Nathria, right at the release of Season 4. So this is how it started, and here is how it's continuing. So what is to be noticed first is that the 3 better performing specs, the 3 strongest specs are still the same. One could argue they are also one of the strongest ones when it comes to Mythic Plus, because Outlaw, we have checked, Mythic Plus a couple of days ago, is the second most popular and powerful spec for melee DPS together with Survival, and they are both at the top in the raid as well. Demo has gotten much closer to Destro in Mythic Plus as well, and they have continued to be the better performer in raid encounters as well. Always worth mentioning that if you were to take away the power infusion gap amongst specs, then Demo would be much further down. They would be in the 6th to 7th type of rank, as opposed to just clear first that they have been for the entirety of this season and last season, mostly because they are the main recipients of power infusion. However, besides these 3 specs being the same, as you can see, the colors are all mismatched between the first week of Castle Nathria and the second week of Castle Nathria. When we look at it the first time, we mentioned the much lower results of rogues, which were both at the bottom. Now the 2 rogue specs are, well, they are still in the bottom half, so it's not that they are doing that much better, but they are definitely not the last ones. Now, that role has been taken up by the 2 mage specs, Frost and Arcane. Last time, Frost and Arcane were actually doing kind of okay, but it doesn't look like it has continued in this week of Castle Nathria. Both mage specs are at the bottom, also both of the druid specs, both Feral and Balance, are at the bottom. Who has not moved across all of this is Demon Hunter, who has remained the 3rd worst of the DPS specs in the raid. To go and find the first significant change in performance, we have to look at Warriors. Warriors were towards the bottom last time we checked Castle Nathria. Now, Arms is somewhat in the middle, but Fury is performing much better. They are currently the 4th better performing melee spec, behind Outlaw, Survival and Unholy. You do also have improvements on Shadow Priest, which has gotten much better, and the reverse is true for Windwalker, which has gotten much worse. You have Enhancement Shaman getting worse, and Retribution Paladin getting better this week in Castle Nathria. And, you know, these results being just 1 week long, and by next week we are already moving to a different raid, means that, you know, you have to take these results mostly at face value. There isn't really too much to take in this type of results. We can look, yes, that's true, we can look at the results of last week, which was Sepulchre. That was the first week of Sepulchre. We haven't gotten to the second week of Sepulchre yet, and the result was very similar, because you still had Demo, Survival and Outlaw once again as the 3 better performing specs, and you had several of the specs we just talked about being more or less in the same situations. You have the Mage specs not doing too well, you have the 2 other Rogue specs doing much worse than Outlaw, you have both of the Druid specs being towards the bottom. The main change from the last week of Sepulchre to this week of Castle Nathria has been Enhancement Shaman and Elemental Shaman somewhat meeting each other in the middle. So rather than having Enhancement Shaman much lower and Elemental Shaman much higher, last week in Sepulchre they were kind of tied together. Surprisingly, Havoc Demon Hunter has done better in Sepulchre last week compared to what we have seen it in the other raids, pretty much towards the bottom, while Windwalker and Destro were also doing better compared to this week in Castle Nathria. As usual, the results in performance don't really reflect one-to-one with the popularity of the specs being played. Because even though it's true that amongst the top 3 most played specs you have Demo and Outlaw, which are currently also the better performing ones, you do see also Beast Mastery at the top, you also see Fire Mage at the top, and you also see Balanced Druid and Havoc Demon Hunter at the top. And these specs are definitely not amongst the better performing ones overall, yet they are still very, very popular. Amongst these, the one that has remained consistently in the top 5, in fact even top 3 most of the time, was Balanced Druid, which also has remained in the bottom half of performance for pretty much forever. The main change, which perhaps underlines how powerful Demonology is looking at Destruction, which is now much lower than it used to be. Now Destruction is less popular than pretty much all of the other range specs besides Affliction, Arcane and Frostmage. Obviously, we also have to say that this season has proven to be much less difficult than previous raids, so perhaps the min-maxing in choosing certain specs, the conviction of several players to reroll to a Flavor of the Month spec is much less powerful than we had in Season 3, so there are way less players willing to reroll just because they can squeeze some more meta specs into their groups or into their raids. Usually that does not really seem to be the case in Season 4, especially for raiding. I understand if you are rerolling because you want to play a powerful spec in Mythic Plus, that's okay, but for the raid, doesn't look like it's really happening for many players. If we were purely looking at all of the 3 raids combined after going through 1 week of all of these 3 different raids, the situation would more or less be something like this when it comes to the melee DPS. You do have 3 clear outliers at the bottom that have remained like this for pretty much all the 3 different raids, Castle Nathria, Sanctum and Sepulchre, which is Feral, Assassination and Subtlety. And then you have a middle of the pack that has been interchangeable depending on the boss fight, depending on the target numbers. You know, Havoc, Announcement, Frost Decay, Ret, Windwalker and Arms have more or less changed around the same level, and then Unholy, Outlaw, Survival and Fury Warrior are the ones that amongst melee DPS have performed better so far in the raid. For the range DPS, we also do have a similar bottom 3 of underperformers in the raid. Arcane Mage, Affliction Warlock and Frost Mage have overall performed the worst out of these 3 different rotating fated raids. The better performer overall, much more in the clear than what we saw for the melee DPS, is Demo. Unlike the melee DPS, changing around a little bit in the rankings depending on the boss fight and of the raids, Demo hasn't really moved from number 1, so they are still there. Below Demo is where you see a few more changes. Elemental Shaman has been overall the more consistent one at the top, together with Fire Mage and Destruction, depending on the raids. Destruction was much better in Sepulchre compared to Sanctum, while Beast Mastery, Shadow Priest and Marksmanship Hunter have remained more or less in the average middle pack of range DPS. Balanced Druid only makes it in here mostly because of their burst window that we talked about every time. Every time we mention that Balanced Druid sucks because it's at the bottom of the rankings, someone will remind you that they are actually stronger than the overall meters imply because of the power of their burst windows. That is still very, very good despite their lacking overall damage. For healers, you know, healers are a little bit harder to gauge because HPS isn't everything, but by gauging the HPS, this is pretty much the obvious result. Currently, we are getting Resto Druid is far and above any other of the specs, followed quite closely by both Holy Priest and Resto Shaman. So this has been the situation so far in the raid. Of course, as we get closer and closer to Dragonflight, more and more of this will mean less and less, because we are bound to see many shakeups, many changes in the meta and many changes in the power of many of these specs before we enter Dragonflight. Of course, it would be the nightmare of every player, I hope, that we enter Dragonflight with the exact same meta of the end of Shadowlands. That would be quite depressing, right? So I do hope for the resurgence of Feral Druid, for the makeover of Red Paladin, and the rise of Affliction Warlock or Shadow Priest, for example, once we get in Dragonflight, which is why it's gonna be the exciting period of the pre-release of Dragonflight. Once we get into the full working beta, we start testing bosses, we start testing Mythic Plus, we start getting simulations, we can start using the full talent trees and start using the rotations and check out how exciting the specs feel and how powerful the specs feel. That's gonna be the more important part as we get closer to the next expansion, to try to gauge the level of each specs, the meta power of each specs as we get into Dragonflight. We can start making our own predictions, our own tier lists for Dragonflight in terms of the power of the specs. But for now, at the end of the second week of Castle Nathria in Fated mode, these have been the results when it comes to the raid. I'm going to leave you with this done to the rest of your beginning of the reset in NA, your soon beginning of the reset in EU. The goodbye is of course accompanied by a round of applause to all of my patrons. Thank you all guys and gals for supporting me. You are contributing to my continued release of content and videos for World of Warcraft as we get closer to the release of the beta of Dragonflight. You can also support even more by liking and commenting down below on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. That would be quite appreciated. Not that it matters, you know, if you want to continue watching videos without subscribing, like I myself am guilty of with many channels. I should actually do better myself before suggesting you do the same for my channel, honestly. But at the very least, by subscribing, you can prove to be better than me, in that regard at least. Also, you can, for further social interactions, you can follow me on Twitter, as well as subscribing to my Patreon, right down at these two links. Subscribing, which will give you access to my Discord server, where you can get in closer contact to me if you want to ask some questions, maybe give some tips about content, future content, some feedback, what you would like to see or what you would like to hear be discussed in one of the future videos. That is usually where I am available. Thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, how did it come to this? I planned to make this video at about 4 PM and I'm looking at the clock now, it's 7:34. How?